Being a professional isn't about the money you make, the position you hold, your level of expertise, or fame. It's the motivation and the attitude you bring to your work. A desire for always learning and improving, and balancing your creative output with getting the business done. Welcome and join the Creating Pros. Hi, and welcome back to Creating Pros. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and this week we are talking about Cleveland Superman and the celebration of all things Cleveland and Superman. I'm joined this week by Dr. Valentino Zullo. Thanks for coming in and joining me this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
So why don't we talk a little bit about what you guys are doing? You know, an entire couple of months here, instead of a lot of the time we do conferences, things like this. This is a multi-month celebration. And so let's talk a little bit about what you guys are up to and doing.
Yeah, so from September 6th through November 2nd, we have, I think it's about 27 programs across the city that will take place in places from one of the Jewish temples to the comic shop to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Cleveland Museum of Art, our local coffee shops, and other places. We are doing this in honor of Superman's 85th anniversary, and it was not supposed to be 2 months. We originally planned for a much smaller event that then became like a month-long event that went to 6 weeks and then 2 months. And my co-director Don Boozer, who is the manager of the literature department at Cleveland Public Library, he often jokes that he had to stop me from adding more events. But I think I think you're right. Usually we do like a conference for like a weekend or at most a week, but it worked out well because it allowed a lot of partners to get involved. And I think it speaks to the desire to highlight Superman in Cleveland, to celebrate Superman in Cleveland. This is the first citywide celebration of Superman in 35 years. And a lot of the organizations like the Art Museum, like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, all wanted to be involved just because, there hasn't been a big celebration, though, we all sort of are indebted to Superman in many ways in Cleveland. I mean, he's sort of just a part of our everyday life. And so that's sort of what we're doing. And I think it's nice that we have a lot of local events. Having a bigger event allowed us to have a lot of local events in different spaces, highlighting literally the Cleveland, Superman's Cleveland, the Cleveland that made Superman, in places like Cleveland Public Library, in places like Glenville. That's where we're going. We're going to the places that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were, or places that, are linked to their legacy, like I said, like the temple or some other locations that we're at. But it should be fun. It's tiring. I think we're on event 6 today. We got 21 more to go. Not that I'm counting.
Having done and run and built a lot of events, there's that thing of it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yes, it did.
But then when it's over, you look at it and you go, okay, wow, what all we got to do. And I think one of the things that, we often look at the memes and how Superman has changed over 85 years. Superman we often see as being that big reflection of what we want American culture to be, basically. Mm-hmm. This is about hope. This is about trying to really come in, and that's one of those things that Superman was one of the first heroes I got raised on. Superman and Batman. Granted, I probably fell a little bit more into that Batman sort of motif because he had fun toys.
That makes two of us.
But that idea of hope. I mean, I remember being a little kid and going and seeing Christopher Reeve in the theater and actually going and seeing that movie. And that really set up Superman for me. It's like your first doctor. It's who's your first Superman? Who was it for you? And what's the importance for you of Superman, not just beyond Cleveland, but just for you?
So I would say the first Superman, my introduction to Superman was the cartoons. It was Super Friends. I just, it was Super Friends. It was on Cartoon Network or something like that, and that was my first sort of introduction to many of the Justice League characters, right? The Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman, the Wonder Twins, who I think fondly of. I think, and Mark Russell did a good story with them a couple years ago. He did like a 12-issue story that I liked. That was my introduction, and then I distinctly remember going to our public library and getting a VHS tape of I cannot remember if it was Superman 3 or 4. I know those are not where you're supposed to start, but I remember I'm about 6 at the time because I know where we were living. We would move when I was 8. So I know I was probably about 6, maybe 7 at the time. And I got it and I loved it. And I don't know that I've rewatched 3 and 4 since then, but it didn't matter to me. It was the VHS tape, and to a kid, I mean, Christopher Reeve is amazing. Even if the story doesn't make sense to an adult, and so I think I hardly cared at 6 about the story, but Christopher Reeve just compelled me like as a kid, and so I went from the cartoon to Christopher Reeve, and then the one that I have the strongest memory with is when I was younger is Brandon Routh as in Superman Returns. That one I was at an age that like that I remember actually wanting to go to the theater. I must have been 12 or 13 at that point. So Brandon Routh is the one that sort of is the one that I have the strongest memory with. But it was the cartoons that compelled me to Superman.
Yeah, and I grew up, again, I grew up with those cartoons, the first run,
Yeah.
the fun, Super Friends of the 70s and 80s and all the rest of that. So, but I think that looking at just kind of that history of how Superman is for so many of us, that anchor, that hero, that one that stands up. And I think that this is, knowing the history, knowing the cultural connection there is to Cleveland. So why does this really fall as important to you? Because again, when we're trying to put on events, we're trying to put these sorts of things together. The reason we let things grow and we help to grow them like this is because they're important to us, right? It's not just it seemed like a fun idea at the time. There's an importance.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can I mean that's an easy one for me. So for me, Superman is a representation of the immigrant story, and perhaps one of the best representations of the immigrant story. And that's important to me. Both of my parents are immigrants. And I'm certainly not Superman, but I think like I recognize, having been born here in the U.S. and both my parents coming from other parts of the world. My mother from Iran, my father from Italy. My mother left a revolution in Iran. My father left the economic downturn in Italy in the 70s, and they came here and found opportunity. And I like to say that I actually got to live the American dream. I mean, my parents came here with nothing, and I went on to get a doctorate, and I teach I use the public education system. I went to public universities. I also spend a lot of time volunteering at our public libraries just because that's how I learned English. English was not my first language. Italian was. It's not that my parents speak English, but they taught me Italian first, and I would say it was being in the library systems that really, and reading comics that taught me English. And so to me, like I see it resonates so much with my story and the importance of that, and understanding, that Superman is an immigrant and he comes here and he makes our world better. And I think that I want to remember that. And that's one of the many things I want to highlight. There's a lot in the Superman story, but that's the thing that touches me, is that I like to think, I was raised by the system of, like I said, like public education. I used all of it, I lived the American dream, and I like to give back as a teacher. I'm also I was also trained as a social worker, which I do less of now, but I try to give back in that way. And I think that that's also Superman's story. And so that's one answer. I have about 10 more, but that's good enough.
So why don't we talk about the cultural history and the foundations of Superman lore in Cleveland? and then we'll talk about the conference itself. So,
Yeah. So I mean, the thing that's super interesting here is that, right, I mean, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster are they are the children of immigrants as well, and they come here and they do they Siegel's family comes directly here. Schuster's family first goes to Canada, but they come here and they're in Glenville. And what's super interesting is that story, that Glenville story, that immigrant narrative will so much define their comics. I think it's all over the comics, and they will incorporate Cleveland so much into the story. And I think it's Brad Ricca who says that, there's something about Cleveland. Maybe it's the gloomy skies that we have so often, or something else about it. But there's something that sort of asks us to look up into the sky, and it's Depression era Cleveland, which is a very sad period. But the beauty is, and I think this comes out in the character too, is their own tenacity, right? Like they spend so much time trying to get this character right, and I think that comes out in the character's own determination too. So much of their own, meaning Siegel and Schuster's own, characteristics come out in Superman. That dedication, that tenacity, that hope. As you mentioned before, the hope, and I think that they hold on to that so much, and they ground Superman in sort of a Midwestern identity, which I think I mean, having grown up in the Midwest my whole life, I identify with something like that. They do that in the sense too of not just Superman's from Kansas, but highlighting local journalism, which is so important to which has defined many I think for many local small towns that is has been historically a good part of their economy is the local journalism, the role that the reporters would play. I think that's all shifted now, but that was such an important part. Is the journalists in the town were important figures, and they really highlight that. And I think that comes out in Clark Kent's story, that here you have Superman, all powerful, or super powerful rather, and he recognizes the power of local journalism, and that comes out a lot in the early Siegel and Schuster stories. I think, especially, there's one, I believe it's issue 10, where Superman goes to prison to take photographs of the abuse of prisoners, and recognizes that just beating up the bad guy isn't enough, that he needs to document the abuses that are going on as a reporter, as Clark Kent, that sometimes there's things that the reporters can do that even a Superman can't achieve. And so part of them, I think all of that comes from the recognition of journalism and sort of their own history, having grown up in a Midwestern city. At the time, a much bigger city. It's a smaller city now.
So let's talk a little bit about the conference. Who are some of the presenters? What are some of the upcoming presentations?
Yeah, so Mark Waid will be coming on October 14th, and that's going to be a lot of fun. He's going to, on the day before, on October 13th, he's going to be doing trivia at Carol and John's Comics, which is a local comic shop. He is known for doing trivia, and he's supposedly great at it. The comic shop guys keep saying they're going to get slaughtered by him. And so we have two teams of people. So we have Mike Sangiacomo, who is a local reporter for the Plain Dealer, and he started the first syndicated comics column in the United States in 1993. He has a team of two. And then John Dudas, who owns Carol and John's Comics, he has a team of two of his shop members that are going to be with him. And it's going to be those two teams versus Mark Waid, because they need 6 people to go up against Mark Waid on trivia. And they still think they're not going to win, which I think is just going to be fun. I've been inviting people, even if they're not interested in comics. I've been saying, I was like, listen, this is like a sports match. This is like, I guess in for us in Cleveland, be like Browns versus Steelers, right? I was like, this is going to be a big deal. And so I think it's going to be a great event. And then the next day, Mark Waid will be speaking at Cleveland Public Library with Brad Ricca, who wrote Superboys, the story of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. October 21st, Sina Grace, who has a book coming out on October 3rd called Superman Harvests of Youth, will be the artist in the atrium at the Cleveland Museum of Art. So it'll be a cool like artist in residence kind of event, and he'll be drawing with kids and families, and he'll be like giving away some sketchbooks and other things. So that's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to that. And then I think the other one I'd like to highlight, another weekend event, especially for out of towners that want to come. On October 28th, Sarah Kuhn, who wrote Lois Lane, Girl Taking Over, will be at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, followed by a live interview with Laura Siegel, Jerry Siegel's daughter. And so that'll be a fun event at the Rock Hall. And so, I mean, it's great. We'll be in the Rock Hall. Laura Siegel will be there. And again, I think sort of just highlighting the Cleveland aspect of this, we wanted to bring Laura Siegel because honestly, it's the closest we're going to get to Jerry Siegel at this point. She still has plenty of stories that have not been told or have not been documented. And we really want to highlight the creators. And she did spend part of her life in Cleveland very early on. And we wanted her to come back to just share with us some stories about her dad, and her mom as well. But so she'll be coming on October 28th to the Rock Hall and telling us some stories about her parents.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that's always fun is to hear sometimes the family stories about the creators, right? Because one of the things I often talk about is, it used to be you only got to find out about the creators, maybe a little blurb, a little bio here or there, something like that. In the modern age of social media and all the stuff that we do, part of the stuff that we do with Continual is you get to know to some extent all the different creators that we work with. You get to find out who this person is, what kind of sense of humor they have, all these sorts of things. And I think that it really gets important to know who it is behind some of these creations, right?
Absolutely.
Is because that's how you get to find out why some of these stories are important. I mean, as we look over time, I mean, over 85 years, there's been a lot of artists that have worked on Superman. There have been a lot of writers that have worked on Superman over the years that have told their takes and their stories around this character. I mean, it's one of those things that is always, when you're working in somebody else's IP, it's always a little bit of a challenge to make sure that you get to tell your view, your take on the story and on the character, but at the same time, keep up that legacy, that history. I mean, because again, for any character that's been around for 85 years, that is this much of a reflection of culture at the time when the story gets told, right? This is going back to that idea of being a reporter, being that voice of truth. And I think this is one of those things that, having had some misspent youth in media, and some since then too, that idea of being both the voice of truth as the person, as well as the superhero that can then go defend justice and everything else we see in Superman lore. I think it's important to know who created them and why. And, the immigrant story is a big part of it because, like you mentioned, these are all things that are really critical, and they were critical to the period of time, as you mentioned, the Depression era, when the hero was created, because the hero was created for the time that he was needed. That's often what we see. And so I think it's great that you're getting some of these stories still about, about how they lived, who were these people, and the influence that their work has now had for this long a period of time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think getting to know the creators is so important. I don't know. I don't think I've mentioned this on the video yet, but I'm an English professor at Ursuline College, and I'm part of what we call our Rust Belt Humanities Lab, and it's a metaphorical lab. There's no lab in the humanities, right? The whole world is our lab. That's so. But it is that we have a sort of this Rust Belt Humanities Lab, and we are thinking about. We want to know about the history of these creators, to listen to their stories, and it impacts us because I think, as you're saying, the characters were created in the moment they were needed. Well, I think they're also revised for moments when they're needed, right? Like characters get revised in different ways. And I think it speaks to something I'd like to point to in comics a lot, is that I often say that if journalism is the first draft of history, comics is the second. And I think that comics, because of the way they're produced so quickly, do tell the story of history before novelists, filmmakers, and then historians, of course. The best example I can give of this is, I mean, Superman is one great example, but the EC comics of the 1950s that Art Spiegelman points to were, as he calls them, a secular response to the Holocaust, did document the Holocaust way before novels would. Most of us of a certain age read Number the Stars or Elie Wiesel's Night or some other novel about the Holocaust, John Hersey's The Wall, in school. But prior to the publication of all these novels and memoirs on the Holocaust, it was the EC comics of the 1950s. It was, Bernie Krigstein and Jack Kamen and Al Feldstein and, of course, Bill Gaines that were documenting the Holocaust. And so that's just one. I think it's the most obvious example. But I would say for a lot of us, it's sometimes it's the first draft of history. I learned about the IRA in Ireland from a Spider-Man comic. I think it was Web of Spider-Man, maybe 9 or 10. I don't remember. I mean, it's their drafts of history, which is super interesting. And I think that speaks to the power of them, but also it speaks to what the creators were interested in. Because obviously, like any historian, they leave stuff out because, what I mean by that is I'm not claiming there's some conspiracy with historians, but historians have to focus on something, right? Same thing that artists do. They focus on what interests them, what's in front of them. And leaving something out it means, like comics, they amplify certain stories, and we just can't tell every story. Not every, that's why we need more stories. But and so I just to say that yes, I think that getting to know the creators, understanding why they're interested in certain things, what aspects of history, whether it's personal, political, global, whatever it is, influences them, is hugely important to understanding how to contextualize the stories.
And I think you're 100% right. I mean, looking at eras of creators, looking at eras of storytellers, but I don't think people know how fast comics move compared to just about every other medium. I mean, really, the only other thing that moves any faster than comics really is the news. And to consider the fact that there is both art and scripted language to create stuff moving that quickly, it allows you to almost run real time. Because a lot of the time, again, I don't think people know how quickly. Yeah, you might have a plan for an arc for the next couple of years, but I mean, those arcs change all the time. The details in them, the things that happen to reflect the events of the time. I mean, that's one of those things I think that is really an interesting thing about comics, is that you can do a lot very quickly. The downside of it too is art takes budget.
Yeah.
But I mean, you get, I think that visual representation to the story is often one of those things that, I mean, I remember when I was a kid growing up, we had comic tracks in the store and stuff like that. Looking at that idea of comics as being a throwaway, and now we look at how they get valued as assets, how they get valued as story, how they're really valued as historical artifacts that tell the story of the period, I think is always been one of those things that has kind of grown on me over the years.
Yeah.
Just going back and looking.
I would say, just to that point, just quickly, I wanted to say that I often refer to, like, I think Superman and Action Comics being now 85, Action Comics being 85 years old, and Superman's as the character 85 years old. I often say it's one of the greatest untapped archives of American history. I don't think we think about it that way very often, but I do think that it is an untapped archive of American history. And certain people have dipped in. Of course, as I mentioned, Brad Ricca, Dennis Dooley has one of the first academic books on Superman. Roy Schwartz, Ian Gordon. I mean, we can name these people on really one hand, maybe two hands, that people have written books historical or critical, like as in academic books on Superman. There's very few of them, and I think like it's a great untapped archive that I think we'll have plenty of work to do with in the future.
So, look, and again, I think kind of going back to the creators. So, we've got Jerry Siegel, we've got Joe Shuster. With those two and telling the story basically of Cleveland, right? How much of Cleveland really is Metropolis?
That's that's a good question. Oh, I that was not a question I expected. How much of Cleveland is really Metropolis? I so okay, so the concrete answer is that the early sketches of what would become sort of Metropolis are, as I understand from the other historians that have worked on this, that the images are of actually Cleveland. I think, I will, and this is I think unfortunate. I think that a lot of Cleveland is not in the stories anymore. I think in the Siegel and Schuster era, they are. I mean, by image, but also literally, I think some of the locations they're going to. I mean, they mention Cleveland, they go to places that are clearly Cleveland, but I think it's one of the things that I lament is that clearly Superman is no longer in Cleveland in the comics. That's okay. I mean, he doesn't have to always be in Cleveland, but but I would say that I think it's a sad thing about the comics that there's not much Cleveland and Metropolis. I think it's a missed opportunity, though. I will say, I think what's interesting is when characters, especially characters that represent marginalized groups, sometimes will end up in new cities. And I think that this could be an opportunity, like for him to go back to Cleveland. To give a specific example, Miss Marvel's set in Jersey City, right? I think it's so interesting when sometimes, and they allow for this with marginalized voices sometimes, that they can go to other cities. Miles Morales is in Brooklyn, right? I mean, Peter Parker's in Soho, but Miles Morales is in Brooklyn, and I think it's an interesting moment where they could lean into that and highlight some of the immigrant history, the Jewish history if he came back to Cleveland or another city. But I understand that I'm giving examples from Marvel, who uses real life cities, and DC doesn't so often. But they could make Metropolis a little more Cleveland, or he could go to a new city for a little while and make it Cleveland. But I would say in the Siegel and Schuster societies, for sure, Cleveland's there. You see it in the drawings, you see it in the spaces they're going. I think right now it's basically New York, but we can't say that.
Everything's either New York or Chicago. I mean,
yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean that's where I remember the oh gosh, is it Paul Kupperberg that writes with Carmine Infantino? They do a Supergirl series in the 80s, and Supergirl goes to study psychology in Chicago, I think, in that series. It's a fun series, and also just read. You should look at it just for the Carmine Infantino art. I mean, his art is stunning, and he did some great stuff with Supergirl. I think he did it right after he was drawing Spider-Woman with I think it was Grunwald. I also sometimes don't know how to say these people's names because they're not on TV, right? So I just sort of like guess that this is how to say these people's names. But yeah, I mean, I think it's either New York or Chicago, and I was surprised DC actually let it be Chicago. Usually they don't like name other cities, but in that 1980 Kupperberg series, Supergirl actually goes to Chicago and she goes to study psychology.
forgot about that. Yeah, I was actually in Chicago about a week and a half ago, and was standing in front of the Trib, building with the nice big globe on top of it, and all of that kind of stuff. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, yep.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more just about Chicago. I mean, about Cleveland. Yeah, from Chicago.
We can talk about Chicago. No, yeah.
Talk about Chicago. So Cleveland, it's been a number of years since I've been. It sounds like everybody across town wanted to be a part of this. The Rock and Roll Museum. Everybody wanted a piece of this. So how is the city embracing the event? Because it sounds like if you're coming in for the event, you're going to be embraced by the city as well.
Yeah, so so our partners, like I said, are so I'm at Ursuline College, which is a small Catholic college. It's a historically women's college run by continue to be run by nuns. And so we partnered with Cleveland Public Library, which is one of the best libraries in the country. And we also are working with Cleveland Reads, which is an initiative of the mayor of Cleveland. So, I mean, right on the front, like our sort of our main partners, one of them is Cleveland Reads. And so we have the support of the mayor. And so the city is very interested in this and they want to be involved. And you are being embraced by the city. A lot of our partners, some of them are like not doing events necessarily, but they're partnering with us just to highlight as like, you know, giving us promotion, other stuff that to highlight some of the stuff they have established at their spaces. For example, the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage, they're not hosting an event, but they have a standing section of their museum dedicated to Superman. And so they're promoting our events and we're also highlighting them in on our website saying like, you know, if you come to Cleveland and between events, you know, check out the Maltz Museum, go to the Siegel House. You can go to see Superman at the airport, and there's a standing exhibit at the Cleveland Public Library. So both in terms of actual events, but also like you have locations you can go to around the city to celebrate Superman. And I think it's been great. Like I said, like the mayor has supported this through the Cleveland Reads program. Tomorrow we'll be at the West Side Market. Which is it's the oldest public market in Cleveland, and the mayor has given 10,000 books to give away at the market through the Cleveland Reads program. Our local comic shop, our representative John Dudas from the comic shop will be coming. Literary Cleveland will be doing some work. Then they got us like 10 hand painted signs that say fresh literature here or something. It's sort of fun. So we're taking over the stalls in the food and the fruit and vegetable atrium, and so we're like doing comics making there and other things, and that's all just because I mean it's owned by the city, and the city let us use that space for a day to make comics and to sign, and Dan Gorman, who did our poster, will be signing. So yeah, I mean, you're really getting embraced by the city. Whatever you decide to do, it will be somewhere you'll get to see a part of the city, or you can see a lot of the city. And that was a goal. We have a problem in Cleveland in that like we have this east side west side divide, and so we tried to make sure that we did not like, you know, do everything on one side of the city. It spans, you know, the whole city. From, like I said, the Jewish temple is on the far east side. The comic shop is the far west side. We have some stuff in the central, what we call Ohio City, which is like sort of the center of Cleveland, but all over. And so you really get to see the city, whatever you do. And that was our goal. I think, how do I put this other than, you know, we didn't want to, I think it's a fear more for me as an academic, probably not fear for others, but I didn't want to take Superman away and like put him up in sort of like, you know, in our like in an auditorium, like on a college campus, and we're all going to sit there and talk about Superman and then say like, isn't this great? Superman's from Cleveland. We wanted the city to be as much a part of these events as possible. And so we tried to find different locations for everything. And everybody was excited. Every time I went up to somebody, I was like, hey, you know, Rock Hall, I said, you know, hey, do you want to be part of this? And I was like, you know, I can't pay for the space. So I was like, I can pay, but, you know, we have these speakers coming. Would you want to host them? They're like, yeah, they're like, you know, we'll give you the space for free. We'll give you everything for free. Just. So it was great. We got a small grant from the Ohio Humanities Council, and that we then used that money to bring in our speakers. And a lot of it's been donation from other spaces. They're like, you know, donating staff time, volunteering themselves. And so it's definitely been a great citywide program.
How many people that are you working with you've discovered are you know, very much Superman fans and just wanted to be part of it just because they're fans?
I'll everybody. So, you know, I don't realize it. Rockhold's a good example. So I wrote to them on a whim. One night, I wrote to the president of the Rock Hall. I didn't know him. I just was like, hey, we're doing this Superman thing. He wrote back next morning. He's like, yeah, he's like, let me get you in touch with my VP of education, who I find out is super into comics. He was hired by, and I cannot remember, I'm blanking on the name now, but the former president of the Rock Hall was the president of Marvel. It's not Bob Harris, it was somebody else.
Yeah.
It was before Harris. Obviously, it wouldn't have been Harris, obviously, but so it was somebody else that I can't remember. But so Jason Siegel, who's the VP of Education, said he's like, oh yeah, he's like, of course, he's like, I keep up with Action Comics. I didn't know. So many people I found out are comics fans, Superman fans in particular, and I was thinking going into this, not that it would be an uphill trek, but I thought, okay, well, I'll have to persuade some people, like, okay, that we're doing this. I haven't had to persuade anybody. I say Superman, and they're all like, great. What day do you want to do it?
So what's the one thing that you're most looking forward to actually seeing that's left, since you guys are already pretty well in the process? What's the number one thing that you can't wait to get to?
So for me, it's always, I've been working with Cleveland Public Library for 10 years, and a lot of our events are variations on things we've done before: book clubs, book signings, comics making, stuff like that. I think what always interests me is when it's something we've never done before. I would say taking over part of the West Side Market is like totally new. I don't know what it's going to be like. That's fun for me. Also, I've mentioned the Rock Hall. That's new. I've never worked with them before, and so again, it's exciting for me when it's new. I know, like I know how a book club's going to go. I know how like an author talk is going to go to an extent. I mean, I love it, but it's always like I always want to see, like, can we try something new? Can we try a new program? And to that point, the trivia with Mark Waid, like, we've never done that before. That will be exciting. I always like just adding in these new elements. So I'm like, okay, how do I organize this? How do we switch it up to keep things interesting, not only for people attending, but also for me? I would say it's the new things that I'm excited most about.
Well, just remember the author signings. They are more afraid of you than you are of them. So wait.
Yeah. I mean, I had, I will admit, I was terrified. So I had dinner with Philip Kennedy Johnson last night. Not just me and him, but there were a few of us that had dinner with him last night because he's going to be speaking this morning or this afternoon. And I was terrified of him. And we had great fun. We were chatting about video games, and I find out that his 9-year-old son and I have the same taste in video games. So, it's if you're wondering what it is, it's we were talking about Zelda, the Tears of the Kingdom, and some of the Mario games. So I think so we were like chatting about stuff like that, and so he's great. I was terrified though. I was like, gosh, this guy writes action comics. What am I going to say to him? And we're talking about video games, and I'm waxing poetic about Chris Claremont's X-Men because he was just asking me about, like, who have you met that you really like and you've had some good times with? And I was like, Claremont for sure. Like, he's fantastic. So we just chatted, and he's super nice. I would say, I mean, everybody is, and he was, but definitely I get scared, and I have to remember that.
So anything else you think everybody needs to know before they come to town?
I feel like I've shared a lot, but I think the only thing I haven't is that, go to supermanscleveland.com. I think I haven't actually said that. So go to supermanscleveland.com. Feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to me directly. My email is valentino.zullo@ursuline.edu, or you can just write to supermanscleveland@gmail.com if you have any questions. But I think just, everything's free. If that, don't think I said that, but if you have any questions, I think those are things I would say, is that, everything's free. We'd love to host people here in Cleveland. If anybody has any suggestions for other things they'd like to see, I hope this won't be the last time we do this. So even that, like, if other people want things to happen, I'm not going to plan a 27-part event next year, but hopefully, we're thinking about the 90th already, and so and hopefully we will do smaller events in between. So I think I'd love to hear anybody who's interested in things that they might share with us. But like I said, go to supermanscleveland.com, check out our events, and we will be printing most of the interviews and other with creators in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics. It's an academic journal that I'm the American editor on. It's a British journal, and I'm one of the American editors. And so we'll print a special issue on Superman that there will be digital copies online. But academic presses are slow. It'll be about a year. But so if you can't make it to Cleveland, wait about a year and you'll get to read the interviews with the creators.
Well, I appreciate you coming and joining me this morning, and hopefully everything goes fantastically well. And looking forward to seeing it. But yeah, appreciate you coming on this morning.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And until next time, this has been Creating Prose.